The morning of February 19th, 1945. Black volcanic sand stretched beneath Private First Class James Davis's boots as his WWII rolled off the transport ship and into the churning waters 7 miles offshore from Iwo Jima. The 23-year-old from Georgia had driven trucks before the war, but nothing had prepared him for this. The 6-wheeled amphibious vehicle, loaded with 5,000 pounds of ammunition and medical supplies, transformed from a boat into a truck without ever stopping. It swam through 8-foot swells, climbed straight up the ash-coloured beach past burning wrecks and scattered equipment, then kept driving inland toward the Marines pinned down under withering Japanese fire. No stopping to transfer cargo, no vulnerable waiting on the beach, no exposed soldiers hauling crates through machine gun fire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Japanese commanders dug into Mount Suribachi had planned for landing craft. They had positioned artillery to pulverize boats stuck on beaches while sailors unloaded them. They had calculated kill zones based on Marines carrying supplies by hand from the waterline to cover, but nobody in the Imperial Japanese Army had planned for American trucks that could swim. The DUKW, nicknamed the Duck by every GI who drove one, represented something the Japanese High Command had never encountered in their defensive calculations. It was a vehicle that eliminated the single most vulnerable moment in any amphibious operation. The moment when men and material had to stop, transition, and become targets. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of amphibious warfare had remained brutally simple since humans first contemplated attacking from the sea. Landing craft could transport soldiers and supplies from ships to beaches. Trucks could move cargo from beaches inland. But that critical transition point, where boats became useless and trucks couldn't yet function, where everything had to be manhandled across sand under enemy fire, that was where invasions stalled and men died by the thousands. The Japanese knew this. Their entire defensive strategy for the Pacific Islands depended on it. When American planners began contemplating the island-hopping campaign that would eventually carry them from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, they faced a logistics nightmare that defied conventional solutions. Every island would require an amphibious assault. Every assault would require tens of thousands of tons of supplies. And every supply operation would require that agonizing, deadly transfer from sea to land, while Japanese artillery and machine guns turned beaches into slaughterhouses. The standard American solution in 1942 involved LSTs, landing ship tank vessels that could beach themselves and drop ramps, allowing cargo to be driven onto sand. But those ships were enormous targets that had to sit exposed while they unloaded. Once empty, they needed high tide to get back to sea, and critically, they could only go as far as the beach. Everything still needed to be transferred to trucks for inland transport. That meant congestion. That meant bottlenecks. That meant supply dumps piling up on beachheads, where a single Japanese artillery barrage could destroy days' worth of ammunition and rations in minutes. The Japanese understood this vulnerability intimately. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi prepared Iwo Jima's defenses in late 1944, he positioned artillery specifically to devastate the beach zones where American supplies would accumulate. When Kuribayashi's staff calculated expected American casualties, they factored in the chaos of beach logistics, the inevitable delays, the exposed supply lines. They believed, correctly based on previous battles, that Americans would need hours to move supplies from waterline to fighting positions, hours when Japanese gunners could methodically destroy both the supplies and the men carrying them. But Kuribayashi and his staff had no intelligence about a strange vehicle that had been quietly revolutionizing Allied logistics since 1943. A vehicle that looked like someone had grafted a boat hull onto a GMC truck chassis and forgot to choose whether they were building something that floated or something that drove. A vehicle that Japanese defensive doctrine simply didn't account for because nothing like it had ever existed before. The DUKW had emerged from an unlikely collaboration between a yacht designer named Rod Stevens Jr., a British sailor named Dennis Pouliston, and engineers at General Motors Corporation. In the summer of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor dragged America into the war, Stevens had watched Army troops struggle through training exercises on a New England beach. He saw the inefficiency, the exposure, the deadly gap between sea and land transport, and being a yacht designer who understood hulls, and being a man who also understood trucks, he envisioned something that had never existed, a vehicle that could be both. The War Department had initially rejected Stevens's proposal in late 1941. Too experimental, they said. Too strange. Too much of a gamble when production capacity needed to focus on proven designs. But a Coast Guard rescue in rough seas off Massachusetts in June 1942 changed everything. When conventional craft couldn't reach a stranded crew in 60-knot winds and heavy surf, an experimental WWII had no trouble. It swam through waves that would have swamped boats. It powered up a beach that would have stopped trucks. And suddenly the Pentagon was listening. By late 1942, General Motors was manufacturing WWIIs at facilities in Pontiac, Michigan, and St. Louis, Missouri. The final design measured 31 feet long and 8 feet wide. It weighed 7.5 tons fully loaded. Under the watertight steel hull sat a modified GMC CCKW truck chassis with 6-wheel drive, powered by a GMC 270 cubic inch inline-6 engine generating 94 horsepower. That single engine drove all 6 wheels when on land through a transfer case and a 5-speed transmission. But it also powered a propeller mounted at the stern for water propulsion at roughly 6 miles per hour. On land, the WWII could hit 50 miles per hour on roads. The engineering challenges had been formidable. How do you seal a truck chassis so it's completely watertight when every axle, drive shaft, and mechanical connection is a potential leak point? How do you protect an engine from saltwater corrosion? How do you make a vehicle stable when it's neither quite a boat nor quite a truck, but attempting to function as both simultaneously? GMC engineers solved these problems through 6 weeks of intensive design work in the spring of 1942. They added a bilge pump system that could handle water infiltration up to 2-inch holes in the hull. They created a transmission that could switch seamlessly between wheel drive and propeller drive. They designed a rudder system that worked in concert with the front wheels, so turning the steering wheel would turn both front wheels and the rudder simultaneously. Drivers needed only one set of controls for both land and water operation. Perhaps most importantly, they gave the WWII something no other vehicle possessed at that time: a central tire inflation system. The driver could adjust tire pressure from inside the cab while moving. Soft tires provided better traction on sand and mud. Hard tires improved speed on roads. The ability to change pressure without stopping meant WWIIs could adapt instantly to whatever terrain they encountered without becoming vulnerable. The first WWIIs arrived in the Pacific Theater in early 1943, assigned initially to Guadalcanal for rear area supply operations. But their first combat deployment came during Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. When rough seas prevented LSTs from reaching Sicilian beaches, WWIIs swam through 8-foot swells, carrying ammunition and supplies directly to troops fighting inland. That performance erased any lingering doubts about the vehicle's capabilities. By the time American forces began the Central Pacific Campaign, assaulting the heavily fortified atolls of Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok in late 1943 and early 1944, WWIIs had become integral to amphibious operations. The Marine Corps, initially skeptical about wheeled vehicles crossing coral reefs, discovered that WWIIs' adjustable tire pressure gave them remarkable capability on jagged coral that would shred conventional truck tires. The statistics that emerged from these operations revealed something the Japanese had not anticipated. In the Marianas Campaign during the summer of 1944, when American forces seized Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, WWIIs transported approximately 35 to 40% of all supplies from ship to shore during the critical first weeks. Traditional landing craft still carried the majority of troops and heavy equipment in the initial assault waves. But for the ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, and equipment that kept those troops fighting, DUKWs provided a continuous supply flow that never stopped, never created beach congestion, and never presented the kind of massed target that Japanese artillery doctrine expected. At Saipan in June 1944, Japanese defenders had positioned artillery to cover the landing beaches with overlapping fields of fire. They expected American supplies to pile up in predictable locations, creating lucrative targets. But DUKW drivers didn't stop on beaches. They drove straight through the kill zones at 25 miles per hour, dispersing inland to forward supply dumps before Japanese gunners could adjust fire. The supplies never concentrated, the target never materialized, and American troops fighting through Saipan's cane fields and ridges never ran short of ammunition. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was difficult to quantify but significant. Soldiers dug into defensive positions, reported seeing American vehicles emerge from the ocean, drive up beaches under fire, and disappear inland without pausing. In a war where every piece of intelligence, every tactical assumption, every defensive calculation mattered, the DUKW represented something that didn't fit Japanese understanding of amphibious operations. It was too strange, too versatile, too outside their framework of what was possible. Japanese military doctrine in 1944 was based on inflicting maximum casualties during the vulnerable transition from sea to land. Their defensive positions, their artillery targeting, their entire strategy for island defense assumed Americans would need time, would create bottlenecks, would expose themselves during the critical hours when supplies moved from ships to fighting positions. The DUKW eliminated that assumption. It collapsed ship-to-shore transition time from hours to minutes. It turned a static, vulnerable process into something fluid and dispersed. When General Kuribayashi prepared Iwo Jima's defenses through late 1944, he had access to intelligence about previous American amphibious operations. He knew Americans had new equipment. He knew they had refined their tactics based on hard lessons learned at Tarawa and Peleliu, but his defensive planning still focused on the fundamentals of amphibious warfare as the Japanese understood them. Marines would land on beaches, supplies would accumulate in predictable patterns, and Japanese artillery, positioned in hardened bunkers across the island, would methodically destroy those supply concentrations while machine guns pinned down the troops. Kuribayashi's plan was sound based on conventional amphibious operations. He fortified Mount Suribachi at the southern tip of the island with artillery and machine guns commanding the landing beaches. He built an elaborate tunnel system connecting defensive positions across the island's volcanic terrain. He stockpiled ammunition and supplies for a prolonged battle. He positioned his 21,000 troops where they could inflict maximum casualties on American forces during the critical first days of the invasion. What Kuribayashi couldn't account for, because Japanese intelligence had provided incomplete information, was the sheer scale of American logistical capability that DUKWs represented. The invasion force that approached Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, included 75,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th and 5th Marine Divisions. Behind them sat 900 ships carrying enough ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, and equipment to sustain prolonged combat. And connecting those ships to the Marines who would fight through Iwo Jima's volcanic moonscape were hundreds of DUKWs operated by amphibious truck companies. The 476th Amphibious Truck Company, an all-African-American unit commanded by white officers, brought their DUKWs through training at Fort Story, Virginia, before deploying to the Pacific in late 1944. These men knew their vehicles intimately. They had practiced swimming through rough seas, driving up beaches, maintaining engines in saltwater environments. They had rehearsed the specific choreography of amphibious operations, where timing meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. When the invasion of Iwo Jima began at 8:59 on the morning of February 19, 1945, the initial waves consisted of Marines in standard landing craft and Amtraks, armoured amphibious tractors that could cross coral reefs and volcanic sand. The DUKWs came behind, swimming toward beaches already under intense fire. Japanese artillery from Mount Suribachi and from positions across the island rained shells onto the landing zones. Machine gun fire raked the black sand. Mortars exploded among Marines struggling to advance through volcanic ash that grabbed their boots and slowed every movement. Private First Class Davis, driving his WWII loaded with ammunition toward the beach, could see smoke rising from burning vehicles and the bright flashes of artillery impacting along the shoreline. The WWII's thin steel hull, less than 1/8 inch thick, provided no armor protection. A direct hit from any weapon larger than a rifle would punch straight through. But Davis's job wasn't to fight. His job was to swim through the chaos, drive onto that lethal beach, and keep moving until he delivered his cargo to Marines who needed ammunition more than they needed anything else in the world at that moment. The Japanese artillery spotters watching from Mount Suribachi had expected landing craft. They had expected boats unloading on beaches. They had expected Americans establishing supply dumps in the same predictable patterns that Marines had used at Saipan and Guam. What they saw instead were dozens of vehicles that emerged from the water, drove straight up the volcanic sand at speed that made them difficult targets, and disappeared toward inland positions before artillery could bracket them effectively. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The WWII drivers developed techniques that maximized survival and efficiency. They approached beaches at angles that minimized exposure time in the kill zone. They varied their routes inland to avoid establishing patterns that Japanese gunners could predict. They never stopped moving unless mechanical failure forced them to halt. This constant motion, this refusal to present a static target, frustrated Japanese defensive calculations that assumed supply vehicles would congregate in vulnerable masses. By the end of the first day on Iwo Jima, WWIIs had delivered thousands of tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and rations to Marines fighting their way inland from the beaches. The volcanic terrain made wheeled transport difficult, but the WWII's six-wheel drive and adjustable tire pressure allowed them to navigate black sand and volcanic rock that would have immobilized conventional trucks. More importantly, they had done it without creating the kind of supply bottlenecks on the beach that Japanese artillery had been positioned to exploit. The 476th Amphibious Truck Company worked around the clock during those first critical days. Crews slept in shifts while their vehicles continued operating. Mechanics performed repairs under fire. Drivers made run after run from offshore ships to forward positions, swimming through waters littered with wreckage and bodies, driving across beaches where Marines were still dying, delivering the supplies that kept the invasion moving forward. The cost was not insignificant. Japanese artillery and mortar fire destroyed dozens of WWIIs during the Iwo Jima operation. The thin hulls that made them light enough to float also made them vulnerable to any direct hit. Drivers were killed, vehicles were sunk, cargo was lost. But the overall supply flow never stopped. For every WTW destroyed, 3 more kept operating. The system was resilient in ways that traditional beach logistics could never achieve. Lieutenant Colonel Yoshida Hajime, a Japanese artillery officer positioned on Mount Suribachi, kept detailed notes during the first week of the battle. His observations, recovered after the war, revealed growing frustration with his inability to disrupt American supply operations. "The enemy vehicles do not stop," he wrote on February 21st. "They emerge from the sea and drive directly to positions we cannot target effectively. Our artillery fire achieves individual hits but cannot create the mass destruction of supplies we observed in previous battles. The Americans have solved the beach supply problem through vehicles we did not anticipate." The scale of WWII operations across the Pacific Theater became clear when American forces began analyzing logistics data after the war ended. In the Marianas Campaign, from June through August 1944, WWIIs transported an estimated 1.2 million tons of supplies from offshore ships to forward positions. During the Philippines Campaign from October 1944 through March 1945, that number reached 3 million tons. At Okinawa, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific, DUKWs delivered 4.3 million tons of supplies over 82 days of brutal combat. These numbers represented something revolutionary in military logistics. For the first time in warfare, amphibious forces could sustain prolonged operations without establishing vulnerable beach supply depots. The DUKW eliminated the need for massive cargo accumulations on shorelines where enemy artillery could destroy days' worth of supplies with concentrated fire. It distributed supply flow across time and space in ways that made interdiction nearly impossible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese defensive doctrine had been built on centuries of understanding about amphibious warfare. Attackers from the sea were vulnerable during transition from water to land. This vulnerability could be exploited through prepared defenses that concentrated fire on predictable target areas. But the DUKW invalidated those assumptions by eliminating the transition. There was no moment when supplies sat exposed. There was no predictable pattern to exploit. The vehicle simply moved continuously from ship to fighting position without ever becoming a static target. The impact on Japanese morale was difficult to measure but significant. Soldiers who had been told they could bleed the Americans through attrition, who had been assured that American supply lines were vulnerable, who had based their defensive strategies on inflicting maximum casualties during the beach transition phase, discovered that Americans had technological solutions to problems the Japanese hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just that Americans had more supplies, it was that they could deliver those supplies in ways that Japanese defensive doctrine couldn't counter effectively. The irony was profound. Japan had entered World War II with some of the most innovative amphibious warfare doctrine in the world. Japanese forces had executed successful amphibious operations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. They understood the challenges of projecting power across water, but they had never developed the industrial capacity or the engineering innovation to create something like the DUKW. And by the time American forces were conducting major amphibious operations in 1944 and 1945, Japanese industry was collapsing under strategic bombing and resource shortages. There was no possibility of developing an equivalent vehicle, even if Japanese engineers had conceived of one. The DUKW also represented something broader about American industrial capacity that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced 21,147 DUKWs. This wasn't a handful of experimental vehicles. This was mass production at a scale that allowed DUKWs to support EATP-5, operate across every theatre of the war simultaneously. The Pacific received thousands. Europe received thousands more. The Soviet Union received nearly 600 through Lend-Lease. British and Australian forces operated over 2,500. This industrial capacity to not just design innovative equipment but to produce it in quantities that made strategic difference was something Japanese military planners had failed to grasp when they calculated their chances of victory in 1941. They had believed American industrial potential would take years to mobilize. They had assumed qualitative superiority, and fighting spirit would compensate for quantitative disadvantages. The DUKW, mass-produced and deployed in thousands, demonstrated how wrong those assumptions had been. At Okinawa, the final major battle of the Pacific War, DUKW operations reached their peak efficiency. The invasion force that landed on April 1, 1945, included more than 60,000 soldiers and Marines. Behind them sat over 1,500 ships carrying supplies for what American planners knew would be a prolonged and brutal campaign. Japanese defenders had fortified southern Okinawa with elaborate tunnel systems and defensive positions that would force Americans to fight for every yard of ground. The battle would last 82 days and cost nearly 50,000 American casualties. But throughout that entire campaign, supply operations never failed. DUKWs maintained a continuous flow of ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and equipment from offshore ships to forward positions, even as Japanese artillery and kamikaze aircraft attacked the fleet. The vehicles operated in all weather conditions, swimming through rough seas that would have prevented conventional landing craft from operating. When 10th Army fired 1.1 million 105mm howitzer rounds during the Okinawa campaign, creating some of the largest artillery barrages of the war, every one of those shells had been delivered to the guns by a supply system that DUKWs formed the critical link in. Japanese defensive strategy at Okinawa, like at Iwo Jima, had been based on inflicting such heavy casualties that Americans would negotiate a settlement rather than invade the home islands. Lieutenant General Ushijima Mitsuru, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army, had built his defenses assuming he could bleed the Americans through prolonged attrition. His artillery targeted predicted supply routes. His defensive positions commanded approaches to Okinawa's ports and beaches. His strategy was to make every American advance cost so much in blood and material that continuing the war would become politically impossible. The strategy inflicted terrible casualties. Okinawa was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. But the supply system never broke. American forces never ran short of ammunition. Medical facilities never lacked supplies. And critically, the beach supply operations that Japanese artillery had been positioned to devastate never materialized in the form that Japanese doctrine expected. DUKWs dispersed the supply flow across dozens of routes and hundreds of vehicles operating continuously. There were no massed targets, no vulnerable bottlenecks, no critical point where Japanese fire could achieve the kind of destructive success that might have changed strategic calculations. The Battle of Okinawa ended on June 22, 1945. Japanese forces had been virtually annihilated, with over 100,000 soldiers killed. American casualties exceeded 48,000, with more than 12,000 killed or missing. The civilian population of Okinawa suffered catastrophically, with estimates suggesting over 100,000 civilian deaths. The battle demonstrated that invading the Japanese home islands would result in casualties that American political and military leaders considered unacceptable. But from a logistics perspective, Okinawa proved that American supply systems could sustain major combat operations indefinitely. The DUKW had been a critical component of that capability. It had transformed amphibious logistics from the most vulnerable aspect of operations to something reliable and robust. And that transformation had happened so completely that by 1945, American planners simply assumed DUKW capability when designing operations. It had become foundational to how American forces projected power across water. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, American forces controlled vast territories across the Pacific that had been seized through amphibious operations. Every one of those operations had relied on supply systems that DUKWs were integral to. The vehicle that Rod Stevens had sketched on a beach in New England in 1941 had become one of the war-winning pieces of equipment that made Allied victory possible. The final assessment of DUKW impact came from analysis conducted after the war by military historians and logistics officers. The consensus was that DUKWs had transported approximately 40% of all supplies delivered during amphibious operations in the Pacific Theater, from 1943 through 1945. This percentage varied by operation. At some smaller island assaults, tracked amphibious vehicles carried more cargo. At major campaigns like the Philippines and Okinawa, DUKWs carried closer to 50%, but across all operations, over all campaigns, the DUKW accounted for roughly 40% of supply tonnage moved from ship to fighting position. That 40% represented millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, engineering equipment, and everything else modern armies require to function. It represented the difference between amphibious forces that could sustain themselves indefinitely and amphibious forces that remained vulnerable to supply interdiction. It represented a technological solution to a problem that had plagued amphibious warfare since humans first contemplated attacking from the sea. For Japanese defenders who had built their entire defensive strategy around exploiting that vulnerability, the DUKW represented something they had never anticipated and could never counter. Their defensive doctrine, their tactical planning, their strategic calculations, all assumed Americans would remain vulnerable during the critical transition from sea to land. The WWII eliminated that vulnerability so completely that Japanese defenders found themselves fighting an enemy whose supply lines they couldn't disrupt effectively. The deeper lesson was about innovation, industrial capacity, and the relationship between technology and tactics. Japanese forces had entered the war with excellent tactical doctrine and battle-hardened troops, but they lacked the industrial base to produce innovative equipment in quantities that made strategic difference. The WWII wasn't just a clever design. It was a clever design mass-produced in numbers that transformed how amphibious warfare functioned. That combination of innovation and industrial capacity was something Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. The men who drove WWIIs across Pacific beaches, like Private First Class James Davis and thousands of others, rarely thought about the strategic implications of their work. They focused on more immediate concerns, keeping engines running in saltwater environments, navigating through surf without capsizing, avoiding artillery fire while delivering cargo to Marines who needed it urgently. But their collective effort, multiplied across thousands of vehicles and hundreds of operations, changed the mathematics of amphibious warfare in ways that contributed directly to Allied victory. The 476th Amphibious Truck Company that operated WKWs at Iwo Jima served with distinction despite facing discrimination in a segregated military. African American soldiers who drove supplies across those volcanic beaches were fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. Yet they performed their duties with professionalism and courage, knowing their contribution was essential to the Marines fighting inland. That contribution would later form part of the moral foundation for the civil rights movement that would transform America in the decades following the war. After the war ended, most WKWs were either scrapped or sold as surplus. Some found new life as rescue vehicles, operating during floods and disasters where their amphibious capability proved valuable in civilian emergencies. Some became tourist attractions, offering waterborne tours in cities around the world, but thousands were simply cut apart for metal or left to rust in storage yards. The survivors serve as reminders of what happened when American industrial ingenuity solved a fundamental problem in military operations. The WKW wasn't the most glamorous piece of equipment from World War II. It wasn't a fighter plane or a battleship or a tank that dominated battlefields through firepower. It was a truck that could swim. But that simple capability, deployed at scale across the Pacific theater, helped win the war against Japan by eliminating vulnerabilities that Japanese defensive doctrine depended on exploiting. The Japanese had expected Americans to struggle with amphibious logistics. They had positioned artillery to devastate beach supply operations. They had built defensive plans around inflicting maximum casualties during the vulnerable transition from sea to land. They had calculated that American will to continue the war would break under sustained attrition during these transitions. What they never expected was that Americans would develop a vehicle that eliminated the transition entirely. That collapsed the vulnerable moment from hours to minutes. That dispersed supply flow across space and time in ways that made interdiction nearly impossible. That transformed the weakest link in amphibious operations into something robust and reliable. The WKW delivered 40% of Allied island supplies in the Pacific, not because it was perfect, but because it solved a critical problem better than any alternative. It wasn't invulnerable. Japanese fire destroyed hundreds of them. It wasn't fast. 6 miles per hour in water was barely faster than a man could swim. It wasn't heavily armoured. A single artillery shell could punch through its thin hull and kill the crew. But it worked. It worked reliably across thousands of operations in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. It worked at scale that made strategic difference. And it worked in ways that Japanese defensive doctrine had no effective counter for because nothing like it had existed before. That was perhaps the deepest irony of all. Japan had started a war confident in their understanding of amphibious warfare. They had studied the problem. They had built defenses based on sound tactical principles. They had positioned forces to exploit what they correctly identified as the fundamental vulnerability in attacking from the sea. And then America showed up with trucks that could swim, and all those careful calculations became obsolete. The legacy of the WWII extends beyond World War II. Modern amphibious vehicles owe their conceptual origins to Rod Stevens's original design, the principle that vehicles should be able to transition seamlessly from water to land without stopping, without vulnerable transfer points, without predictable patterns that enemies can target. That principle remains foundational to how militaries conduct amphibious operations today. But the WWII also represents something broader about innovation during wartime, about how solving practical problems through engineering can have strategic consequences, about how industrial capacity to produce solutions at scale matters as much as the quality of the solutions themselves, about how assumptions built into defensive doctrine can become fatal weaknesses when attackers develop capabilities that invalidate those assumptions. Japanese commanders who had prepared so carefully to defend their island strongholds discovered that Americans had changed the rules of amphibious warfare in ways they couldn't adapt to quickly enough. By the time Japanese intelligence understood the full implications of WWII operations, by the time they revised defensive doctrine to account for dispersed supply flows and continuous vehicle movement from ship to fighting position, the war was already lost. American forces had seized the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each operation had been sustained by supply systems that WWIIs made possible. The vehicle that emerged from Rod Stevens's observations on a New England beach in 1941 had become one of the silent war winners. Not through devastating firepower, not through revolutionary tactics, but through solving a fundamental logistics problem so effectively that it changed how amphibious warfare functioned. That solution, mass-produced by American industry and operated by thousands of soldiers across the Pacific, helped ensure that when American forces landed on hostile beaches, they could sustain themselves indefinitely, regardless of what defensive obstacles they faced. Japan never expected amphibious ducks to transport 40% of Allied island supplies. They never anticipated that Americans would solve the beach logistics problem through engineering innovation and industrial scale. They never prepared for an enemy whose supply lines couldn't be interdicted through artillery fire and defensive positions that had worked against conventional amphibious operations. That failure of anticipation, that gap between Japanese expectations and American capabilities, contributed to Japan's defeat in the Pacific. It wasn't the only factor. American naval superiority, strategic bombing, submarine warfare, and the atomic bombs all played crucial roles. But the humble WWII, swimming through Pacific waters and driving across volcanic beaches with supplies that kept American forces fighting, was part of the technological and industrial superiority that made victory inevitable once American productive capacity fully mobilized. The story of the WWII is ultimately a story about how wars are won not just through courage and tactics, but through solving practical problems at scale, about how logistics, the unglamorous work of moving supplies from one place to another, can be as strategically decisive as any battlefield victory, about how assumptions built into military doctrine can become lethal vulnerabilities when opponents develop solutions that doctrine never accounted for. Private First Class James Davis survived Iwo Jima. He would later participate in the Okinawa campaign, driving WWIIs across those beaches as well, delivering supplies under fire day after day until the Japanese surrendered. He returned home to Georgia after the war, found work as a truck driver, and rarely spoke about his service. But he had been part of something significant. He and thousands of other WWII drivers had helped transform amphibious warfare. They had made possible the island-hopping campaign that carried American forces across the Pacific to Japan's doorstep. They had done work that Japanese commanders never anticipated and couldn't effectively counter. The technological revolution that the WWII represented didn't end when the guns fell silent in August 1945. The vehicle's impact rippled forward through decades of military thinking about how to project power across water, how to sustain forces in hostile territory, and how to solve the eternal problem of moving supplies from ships to fighting positions without creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The lessons Japanese commanders learned came too late to change the outcome of their war, but those lessons were studied carefully by military theorists around the world in the years that followed. Soviet forces, who received nearly 600 DUKWs through Lend-Lease during the war, were so impressed with the concept that they developed their own version, the BAV-485, which remained in production until 1962. The Soviets added a rear loading ramp and modified the design for river crossing operations, adapting the core concept to their own strategic requirements. But the deeper lesson was about the relationship between defensive doctrine and technological innovation. Japanese forces had built their entire Pacific defense strategy on sound tactical principles developed through centuries of military experience. Attackers from the sea were vulnerable during the transition from water to land. This was an immutable fact of amphibious warfare, proven in countless operations throughout history. Japanese defensive positions, Japanese artillery placement, Japanese tactical planning, all exploited this vulnerability because it had always existed and always would exist, except it didn't. American engineers had eliminated it through a vehicle that cost approximately $8,000 per unit to manufacture and could be operated by soldiers with minimal specialized training. The strategic implications were profound. Defensive doctrine built on assumptions about enemy vulnerabilities became obsolete when those vulnerabilities could be engineered away through relatively simple technological solutions deployed at industrial scale. The cost-benefit analysis was striking. Each DUKW cost less than a single fighter aircraft. Yet the aggregate impact of 21,000 DUKWs, transforming amphibious logistics across multiple theaters, simultaneously was arguably as significant as entire air wings. This was force multiplication through solving practical problems, rather than through adding raw combat power. It was victory through eliminating weaknesses, rather than through overwhelming strength at the point of contact. Japanese military leaders who survived the war and later wrote memoirs or gave interviews often returned to this theme. They had understood American material superiority in terms of numbers: more ships, more planes, more tanks, more artillery. What they had underestimated was American capability to identify tactical vulnerabilities in their own operations and develop technological solutions that eliminated those vulnerabilities before they became operationally significant. Vice Admiral Motome Ugaki, who commanded the 5th Air Fleet during the final year of the war and survived to write extensive diaries that were published posthumously, made this observation in an entry dated July 19, 1945, 1 month before the surrender. He wrote about observing American supply operations during the Okinawa campaign from Japanese reconnaissance reports. The enemy has solved problems we did not realize could be solved. Their supply vehicles operate in both water and on land without distinguishing between the two environments. Our artillery, positioned to devastate supply accumulations on beaches, fires at dispersed targets that never concentrate in ways our doctrine anticipated. We planned to destroy their logistics. They engineered logistics that cannot be destroyed through conventional means. Ugaki's assessment captured something essential about why Japan lost the Pacific War beyond simple material disparity. American forces didn't just have more equipment, they had different equipment that changed how operations functioned at a fundamental level. The DUKW was one example among many, but it was particularly significant because it addressed the single most vulnerable moment in amphibious warfare, the moment when Japanese defensive doctrine was specifically designed to inflict maximum damage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.